Hi there, welcome back everyone. Welcome to week 2. I'm recording this on the morning of Monday, June the 9th, almost 11 a.m. Wanted to recap some of what we talked about or where we ended last week talking about feminist criticism. But before I do that, I want to point out to you that I have not looked at all of the quizzes yet. I'm making my way through those and grading them. You will see some comments that are attached to the assignments, particularly during the first half of the summer semester. As we are getting closer to the end, I anticipate that there will not be a need for me to offer as many comments, particularly on the final. But probably on the essays, you will continue to see comments on those. I'm going to be posting some ideas, some topics for your first essay, and want you to think about that. And also, I kind of want you to think about what you want to do with the essay assignments. I'm a big believer in empowering my students to own whatever the topic is, whatever is most interesting to them. If there are ways in which the list of topics doesn't interest you, then let's talk. Let's set up a time for us to talk, and let's see where your mind and where your studies want to go. I'm a big believer that students should be able to own their work intellectually, and they should be able to enjoy it rather than kind of picking from a list of things that none of the topics are really your scene, but you do it because it's on the list. I want you to have full ownership of your ideas and what is interesting to you. So you'll be seeing that list. Hopefully something will stick. If we need to discuss it some more, by all means, I'm available to you and we can go forward from there. Want to say that the essays are going to rely pretty heavily on schools of criticism. We're going to continue to work through the different schools of criticism. By the time that we finish next week, we should be hitting all the major schools of criticism. We may do a little bit of cleanup work, but we should be hitting all the schools of criticism so that you know what you will be doing as you are doing your studies in the essays. With the final is going to be made up of your weekly discussion questions. There will be a study guide that I will be publishing this week that will be a collection of all of the weekly discussion questions from now until the end of the semester, so that you can have them in front of you and you can have kind of a primary document that you can continue to work through and copy and paste answers into. However, your final exam is reliant on your own answers. So in the discussions, you are going to be working collaboratively, and I do not have any issue with you doing that. In fact, I encourage you to do that. However, when you turn in the final exam, you are responsible for your own answers, meaning that if you see that someone is answering questions week after week and they're not really doing a thorough job and not doing a complete job, and all you're doing is you're copying and pasting those answers into the final, you will be graded in terms of the nature of the answer. So if the answer was never given, or if it was a really bad answer, or if it was an incomplete answer, and you copy and paste that answer into the final exam, you are still going to be graded on the basis of that response. So we want to be mindful of that. If you see someone who is working in the discussions, if you see someone who is not pulling their weight in the discussions, you want to be mindful of that and be aware of that, rather than be penalized for someone else's absence in their work. Again, the final exam will be all of the weekly discussion questions, all of those chapter discussion questions that are being put forward to you week after week. You're already a little bit familiar with that, with the nature of the discussion questions from last week and looking at the ones that are posted this week. You just want to keep an eye on who is answering, how they're answering, and if you need to kind of step in and continue with that answer or fill in the gaps for questions that were not answered, you want to be aware of that. And again, work collaboratively here. Okay, so we are going to talk about feminist criticism, or some concluding thoughts on feminist criticism. And then I will be moving on to other schools of thought this week, particularly the psychoanalytic criticism, reader response, and post-colonial criticism. Those are the ones that I have on my list to work through this week. So let's get started in recapping with feminist criticism. Now, What I talked about last week in terms of feminist criticism may have felt a little bit jumbled or a little bit rushed. I wanted to be very respectful of your time. I know that we kind of started on a Wednesday and we were just trying to crunch so much information in by end of day on Friday. So I wanted to be respectful of that, and I knew that I could revisit some of it this week, and so here I am revisiting it. And one of the things that I said about feminist criticism is that the way that I talk about this in my American Lit classes is that there are different waves of feminism or different concerns, different issues that those waves would have wanted to address. So looking at the 20th century, if we were to talk about first wave feminism, just first wave feminism, all that first wave feminists were looking for was the right to vote. That's it. That is the only concern, and they wouldn't even call themselves feminists. So if we are looking at that, we're not going to get too far in terms of feminism, and we're not going to get a lot of coverage on the issues of feminism as it is familiar to us living today in 2025. In second wave feminism, we are expanding on that, and what we are finding, again, moving through the 20th century with second wave feminism, is that women have been given the right to vote, but there are a lot of other rights that they don't have. And the ideal here is that if women had the right to vote, they would be able to vote on having other laws or having access to other laws. So kind of seen in a revisionist way, first wave feminism was not about the right to vote. It was about having access to the law. Second wave feminism is that once women have access to the law, are they being treated as equals? Well, unquestionably, the answer to that is no, and will not be yes. For many, many decades, debatably, not even today in 2025. Third wave feminism we see in the middle of the 20th century, and women have been given the right to vote. They have been given the right to their own money and having access to a job. What is being discovered is that although women have access to a job, they are not being paid fairly, equally, or equitably. And so third wave feminism is trying to challenge that, and also trying to challenge the treatment of their gender and the treatment of their sex in the workplace. There is a lot, third wave feminism is driven a lot by harassment issues and sexual harassment in the workplace, and also kind of picking up a lot of what was left behind in first and second wave feminism. In other words, what we're seeing here kind of moving through the 20th century is that none of the issues are truly ever being resolved. They just are being carried forward into a new generation. And if we are trying to do that for a period of time that was several thousands of years ago, we need to be historically and culturally sensitive and say that what we know of as feminism will not exist for thousands of years. However, we do see that the concerns for equality in terms of gender, in terms of sex, in terms of sexuality, is very much appearing in the text. So, rewinding, looking just at first wave feminism, do we see women having access to the law? Do we see women having access to voting rights in the Hebrew scriptures? Sidebar. We need to get into the habit of calling what is often called the Old Testament by Christian communities. We need to get into the habit of calling this the Hebrew scriptures, because that is both culturally and academically and professionally more accurate and more sensitive. If we are going to call the major collection, the major religious text of the Jewish people, the Old Testament, that presupposes that this is an ancient document, which pretty much every Jewish individual that I've ever met would say the book is alive and well in the hearts and minds of the Jewish community. It is not old. It is still very much young and alive for them. So to say that it's the Old Testament also presupposes that it can be set aside for a new revelation or a newer document, what the Christians would call the New Testament. And it kind of creates all this tension, conflict, and grit between communities that are very much aligned in a lot of ways. So we want to be particular in calling what is called the Old Testament, we want to call this the Hebrew Scriptures, and what is called the New Testament, we want to call that the Christian Scriptures. In the same reasoning, I would say that someone who would identify as a member of the LDS community, the Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, if they were to come along and they were to say, well, the Book of Mormon is the primary religious text, and all that other stuff is just kind of a waste of time. It's so antiquated, it's so old, we can just forget all of it. I would object pretty strongly to that. And I love the Book of Mormon as a religious, as a sacred text. I love the Book of Mormon. But I would take tremendous offense if someone were to come along and say, all this New Testament, Old Testament stuff, we can just do away with all that, because it's been superseded by a new religious text. No, that wouldn't jive with me at all. We want to be, again, culturally, religiously, scholastically, academically, we want to be very sensitive to that and call this the Hebrew Scriptures, the Christian Scriptures, and then later documents. Okay, so let's dive back into first to feminist criticism. So with first wave, we are looking at women having access to the law. Do we see that in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures? We do. We want to be very particular in how, why, and in what ways the narrative is inclining itself or lending itself to those concerns of women having access to the law. So in the book of Genesis, which is this collection of stories, which I think is great, I grew up with my parents reading the book of Genesis to me. That's not a flex. That's just one of the books that they chose to read to me, right alongside Dr. Seuss, right alongside Saturday morning cartoons. They were trying to put the Bible front and center for me, and they read the book of Genesis to me a lot as a kid. And one of the things that I remember as a child is that there were so many stories that I objected to, that I took issue with, that I questioned, and I wanted to know, why did the story end that way? Why did the story go in that direction? Yes, I did this as a child. And if that was true for me then, I trust that the same is true for you today. Even if you are no longer 6, 7, and 8 like I was, that there are pieces of the story that you will object to, that you will have questions about, that you will push back against. And as it concerns the treatment of women, this is one of those things that even today still continues to raise questions over my head. For example, we talked last week about how women are being treated in the book of Genesis, like Sarah, who is being moved around as this power piece or this bargaining chip that Abraham will say, well, she's actually my sister, she's not my wife, and he does that to protect his own life, not hers, but Abraham's own life. He will use Sarah as kind of this bargaining chip that he always has. Sarah will kind of walk away from the marriage. We see at the end of her life that she is no longer living with Abraham, and she is buried by her sons, plural, who give her honor. And then we get into the next book where we see Exodus is writing these laws that women are co-equal, co-laborers, co-everything. Miriam, as an example, is on equal footing with her brothers Moses and Aaron. No one questions her authority. No one says that she is not a leader. She is given full authority over the Israelite community. And I do not mean that in the egalitarian or equalitarian sense where we are equal but different roles. No one is saying that. Miriam is the leader, is one of the 3 co-equal leaders of the Israelite community. And so this is quite the pivot point, that we would have women who are used as bargaining chips in their marriage, and also women just a few centuries later who are equal leaders on the run from the superpowers of the world. How do we reconcile these? But then we go a step further, and in the back half of Exodus, and also in the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the remaining books of the Torah, what we see is that women are being written into the law, again, bringing us back to the concerns of first-wave feminism. Women are being written into the law, and the ways in which they are being written into the law are not always great, or do not always reflect that co-equal, co-laborer, co-everything status that has been enshrined in the life of Miriam. And we would say, well, maybe that was just Miriam. Maybe she was so exceptional. No, because what we see being written into these stories about how the law is being enacted, which is still part of the law, having worked for a law firm, I can tell you that there are a great number of court cases that are being used if you've ever been in a personal injury situation and you've had an attorney, they are not only using the statutes of the law, but they're also using the narrative of the law to contextualize that law about why a judge or why a ruling was made in one person's favor and against another person's favor. And we see that remarkably in the books of Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that the law is not only being set down as a law, but it is being discussed. And the ways in which it is being discussed is that you have cases where you say, well, if two parents are dying, then their estate or what they have is being inherited by the firstborn son. And then you have stories where there's one family that steps forward and they said, well, our parents did not have a son, but they did have a number of daughters. Who among us is the one who should inherit the family's estate? And it gives everyone pause because the law was written to favor a firstborn son. So do you write the law, or was the law written in a limited way that would not include a firstborn daughter? Do the daughters need to be married and it would go to their husbands but not to them, which means that if we lived under that law, if my wife's parents died, everything would go to me? That doesn't seem right, rather than her, which would make the most sense. What are we doing with these laws that we were enacting? And so a feminist would say, well, not only are we writing laws that will disfavor women, but when women are going forward and questioning those laws, sometimes those laws are continuing to be doubled down on to favor men. Hey, what's that about? You say that you want to enshrine women as these co-equal laborers, as these co-inheritors of the law. And then when challenged, you're continuing to uphold a patriarchal system that privileges men just because they're men. What's that about? A feminist would want to pay attention to that. If we were moving into second wave feminism, where it is assumed that women are co-equal laborers, will you treat them fairly? Again, the Torah has a great deal to say about this. If we move into third wave feminism, where we say, okay, we assume that women will be in the workplace, that they will be co-laborers in whatever we're doing as work, and they should be treated fairly, will we go a step further and say that they should be treated fairly and also should be paid fairly and should also be protected from those hiccups in our laws that would privilege men and would disadvantage women? A feminist would have a great deal to say about this.